A black and white photograph dated circa 1868 shows Cologne Cathedral fully standing, twin spires complete, stonework intact, yet the ground around it tells a different story. The streets are unfinished. The surrounding city appears raw, uneven, half-formed. No crowds, no commerce, no density. The caption in a municipal archive describes it simply, DOM, nearing completion. But the cathedral had already been completed decades earlier, officially consecrated in 1880 after centuries of intermittent construction. And yet, in this image, the structure appears finished before the modern city seems to exist around it. Census rolls from Cologne in the same decade list population fluctuations that do not align with visible urban density. Exhibition guidebooks from the Rhineland describe infrastructure projects still underway, sewers, boulevards, transit, long after monumental stonework supposedly rose. The surface explanation is mundane photography, redevelopment, urban growth. But what if the city did not rise around the cathedral? What if the cathedral was already there? And what exactly was rebuilt afterward? The textbooks present Cologne Cathedral as a triumph of German perseverance. Construction began in 1248, the narrative states, halted during the Reformation, then resumed in the 19th century as a nationalist symbol. The building itself becomes the proof, 600 years of accumulated ambition finally realized in Gothic stone. The timeline appears in every municipal history, every guidebook, every commemorative volume published after 1880. The cathedral represents continuity, they say. Faith sustained across centuries, a civilization that refused to abandon its sacred architecture even through plague, war, and political fragmentation. The story feels satisfying in its completeness. Medieval foundations, Renaissance interruption, Romantic revival, industrial era completion, each phase documented, each transition explained. The narrative arc mirrors Germany's own mythology, interrupted but never broken, eventually restored to glory. Smooth pages turn in library reading rooms, clean dates anchor the progression. Official photographs from the dedication ceremony show crowds, banners, civic pride on display. Everything aligns until you look at what came before the ceremony. Until you examine what the photographs actually show rather than what they are meant to commemorate. Until you notice that the completed cathedral appears in images where the surrounding city does not yet exist in any recognizable form. The accepted story stands on documentation. But documentation, examined closely, can reveal more than it intends. Why do the earliest photographs of a newly completed structure feel less like culmination and more like rediscovery? The photograph exists in multiple archives, Cologne Municipal Collection, Prussian state records, and private holdings later donated to regional museums. Always the same image or variations, captured from similar angles during the same approximate period. The cathedral dominates the frame, twin spires reaching skyward with mathematical precision, Gothic tracery complete, rose windows intact, flying buttresses support the nave walls with engineering that supposedly took decades to perfect. But the ground tells a different story. The streets surrounding the cathedral appear provisional, dirt pathways rather than cobbled boulevards. Buildings in the middle distance seem sparse, disconnected, temporary. The foreground shows empty space where a thriving medieval to modern city should press against its central monument. No market stalls, no visible crowd movement, even accounting for long exposure times, no density of urban life. Early albumen prints required extended exposures, sometimes several seconds. Moving figures might blur or disappear entirely from the frame. This explanation appears in photographic histories, technical manuals, and museum placards that accompany 19th century images. But exposure time does not erase architecture. It does not remove cobblestones or make boulevards vanish. It does not explain why infrastructure appears absent rather than simply motion blurred. A photograph from 1871, now held in the Rhineland Regional Archive, shows the cathedral from the southwest. The notation on the reverse reads, "Cathedral completed, surrounding improvements ongoing." The phrasing suggests the monument preceded the modern city rather than crowned it. Other images from the same period show similar patterns. Grand structures standing amid undeveloped or minimally developed surroundings. Not construction sites with visible scaffolding and material yards, just emptiness, as though the buildings waited for their cities to arrive. The silence in these images carries weight. Not the blur of passing pedestrians or the ghost traces of moving carriages, but genuine absence. Space where activity should be, but is not. The official explanation remains consistent: long exposures, ongoing development, and the photographic limitations of the era. Individually plausible, collectively, they strain. If the city was alive during these years, thriving enough to complete a monument of this scale, where is the evidence of that life in the photographic record? Prussian census records from the 1860s and 1870s present Cologne as a growing urban center. Population figures climb steadily: 1860, approximately 130,000, 1870, approximately 135,000, and 1880, approximately 145,000. The numbers suggest density, commercial activity, and residential expansion. A city substantial enough to support major construction projects and civic improvements. Municipal tax rolls corroborate the census. Property ownership documented, commercial licenses issued, residence permits filed and archived. The administrative apparatus of a functioning city appears complete in the paperwork. But photographs from the same decades show streets that seem inconsistent with these numbers. Wide thoroughfares appear empty, not from motion blur, but from genuine absence of traffic. Residential areas show fewer buildings than population figures would require. Commercial districts appear underdeveloped relative to the economic activity that tax records supposedly document. A census notation from 1864, preserved in provincial archives, reads simply, "Recorded residence confirmed." The brevity suggests routine bureaucratic process. No ambiguity, no qualification. The numbers carry official certainty. Yet that certainty sits uneasily against the visual evidence. If 130,000 people inhabited Cologne in the early 1860s, where did they live in photographs that show scattered buildings and provisional streets? If commerce thrived, why do images show so few shops, markets, and warehouses? The disconnect appears in other German cities as well. Berlin photographs from the 1860s show similar patterns, grand structures amid surprisingly sparse surroundings. Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Munich present the same visual contradiction between documented population and photographic emptiness. Official explanations cite selective photography, underdeveloped residential zones outside camera range, and concentration of population in areas not frequently photographed. Each explanation holds individually. But the pattern persists across too many cities, too many decades, too many archives. Numbers insist on presence. Documentary evidence confirms bureaucratic activity, yet images insist on absence, on space unfilled, on infrastructure awaiting inhabitants. When records disagree with visual documentation, which evidence do we trust? The administrative certainty of census rolls or the silent testimony of albumen prints that show a world not yet fully populated? By the 1870s and 1880s, Cologne municipal records document extensive infrastructure projects, sewer systems, paved boulevards, gas lighting installations, and tramline construction. These improvements appear in budgets, engineering reports, and completion certificates archived in civic collections. but the timeline feels reversed. Photographs show the cathedral complete by the late 1860s, yet major street improvements and underground infrastructure arrive afterward, sometimes decades later. Sewer construction intensifies in the 1880s, boulevard paving accelerates in the 1890s, the modern urban grid emerges after the monument that supposedly crowned it. Conventional urban development follows a different pattern. Infrastructure typically precedes or accompanies monumental architecture. Cities grow incrementally, roads, then buildings, then civic monuments, as expressions of accumulated wealth and population. The practical comes before the symbolic. Yet in Cologne and similar cities across Europe, the pattern appears inverted. The cathedral stands complete, while the city around it seems to materialize gradually, as though growing to meet a structure already present. An 1889 municipal report describes completion of boulevard systems connecting major civic monuments to residential and commercial districts. The language suggests the monuments existed first, with connecting infrastructure added subsequently to integrate them into expanding urban fabric. Engineering records show sewer systems designed to serve areas around existing major buildings, street layouts curved to accommodate structures already present. The planning documents describe infrastructure adapting to architecture, not architecture placed within planned infrastructure. Modernization lagged monumental ambition. This becomes the standard explanation. Cities focused resources on symbolic projects, while practical infrastructure developed more slowly. Civic pride outpaced practical planning. But this explanation requires accepting that multiple cities across Europe made the same strategic choice, prioritizing cathedrals and monuments over functional urban systems. It requires believing that populations tolerated primitive infrastructure while massive resources flowed to decorative stonework. Monuments usually crown cities, expressions of wealth, population, and civic achievement. They arrive after the city proves itself capable of sustaining them. What kind of civilization builds backward, completing monuments before establishing the basic infrastructure necessary to support the populations that supposedly built them? The pattern extends beyond Cologne. Notre Dame in Paris, though genuinely medieval in origin, underwent extensive 19th century restoration that photographs document as surprisingly complete amid surrounding areas still showing pre-Haussmann urban fabric. Milan Cathedral, officially finished in the early 19th century, appears in photographs as a monumental outlier amid streets that seem provisional. Across Europe, Gothic and Neo-Gothic cathedrals appear fully realized in photographs that show their surroundings as less developed, less finished, less established than the monuments themselves. The structures share characteristics: engineering precision, stonework completion, decorative elements intact, while their urban contexts show construction, renovation, or underdevelopment. The official narrative treats each cathedral as an individual case. Notre Dame, medieval foundation with 19th century restoration. Milan, delayed completion of a centuries-long project. Cologne, nationalist revival of abandoned medieval ambition. Each story contains internal logic. But viewed together, a different pattern emerges. Similar architectural styles appearing across multiple countries, similar completion timelines clustering in the mid to late 19th century, similar photographic documentation showing monuments amid less developed surroundings. The synchronicity seems remarkable. Multiple cities in multiple nations all decided, roughly simultaneously, to complete or extensively restore Gothic monuments while their modern infrastructure remained under development. All achieved similar levels of architectural sophistication. All appear in photographs with similar contrasts between monumental architecture and provisional surroundings. Coincidence can explain individual cases, random variation produces occasional patterns. But when the same architectural style, the same completion timeline, the same photographic documentation appears across national borders and geographic distances, Coincidence strains. One cathedral appearing complete before its city could be an anomaly, perhaps explained by civic priorities or photographic timing. 3 cathedrals showing the same pattern is a coincidence worth noting. A dozen cathedrals across Europe, all appearing fully realized in photographs showing underdeveloped surroundings, all completed or restored within a few decades, all displaying similar architectural sophistication, create a synchronicity that suggests coordination, inheritance, or revelation rather than independent construction. Is this pattern coincidence or synchronization, random variation, or systematic unveiling? The monuments stand, the photographs remain, the pattern persists. Gothic cathedral engineering represents remarkable architectural achievement. Pointed arches distributing weight, flying buttresses channeling lateral forces, ribbed vaults spanning vast interiors. The mathematics involved require sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics, load calculation, and material properties. Historical records document the sourcing of materials for Cologne Cathedral's 19th century construction phase. Stone quarried from specific sites. Timber imported for scaffolding, iron reinforcement used for structural support. The logistics appear in procurement records, transportation manifests, and construction budgets. But the engineering sophistication seems to exceed what local populations and available technology supposedly supported. Load-bearing calculations preserved in archive marginalia show mathematical precision that required training and experience beyond what construction crews of the era demonstrably possessed. Stone cutting techniques visible in the finished structure match precision that hand tools should not have achieved at the documented speed. An 1875 engineering assessment now held in the Cologne Cathedral archive notes that structural completion proceeded with remarkable efficiency given available resources. The phrasing suggests surprise at the pace of work, as though the results exceeded expected capacity. Similar assessments appear in documents related to other major construction projects of the period. World's Fair buildings were erected in months when similar structures supposedly required years. Railroad infrastructure appeared across continents with a synchronicity that logistics barely explain. Urban renewal projects transformed entire districts in timeframes that seemed compressed. The standard explanation is that industrialization accelerated construction capacity. New materials, new tools, new organizational systems enabled achievements previously impossible. Progress explains the achievement. But industrial progress typically shows incremental improvement with occasional breakthroughs. Learning curves demonstrate gradual mastery, yet the architectural achievements of the mid to late 19th century appear suddenly, without the experimental failures and incremental refinements that characterize technological development. These structures feel less like experiments and more like implementations of knowledge already possessed. They feel less like ambitious projects pushing technical boundaries and more like recreations of forms already understood. Who builds monuments requiring engineering sophistication beyond documented workforce capacity? Who sources materials and erects structures at speeds that logistics barely support? Who builds for a population that has not yet arrived in a city not yet fully formed around the monument already standing? German foundling hospital intake logs from the 1880s and the 1890s show unusual patterns. Sudden influxes of children without traceable lineage. Repeated notations state parentage unknown, delivered without record. These are not occasional entries, but systematic documentation of children appearing without origin stories. An 1883 intake form from a Rhineland foundling hospital, preserved in regional welfare archives, lists 17 children admitted in a single month. For each, no parental information, no birth records, no documentation of family circumstances. The form concludes, origins unknown, accepted for institutional care. This pattern was not unique to Germany. New York orphan asylum records from the same period show similar surges. Children arriving without documentation were placed in institutional care and eventually distributed through adoption or labor placement systems. The orphan train movement in the United States transported over 200,000 children westward between 1854 and 1929, many with minimal documentation of their origins. Official explanations cite urban poverty, industrial displacement, and family dissolution during rapid modernization. Parents, unable to care for children, surrendered them to institutions. Economic crisis produced social breakdown. These explanations appear in social welfare histories, reform movement literature, and institutional records. The official account emphasizes poverty and upheaval, but the scale seems disproportionate. The documentation gaps appear systematic rather than random. Why would so many children arrive with absolutely no traceable lineage? Why would intake records across multiple institutions, multiple cities, multiple nations, all show similar patterns of undocumented origin? Repopulation requires bodies. If a civilization experienced interruption, catastrophe, reset, or discontinuity, the aftermath would need inhabitants. Children represent demographic renewal, but children without documented origins offer renewal without genealogical continuity. Repopulation becomes a central concern. The orphan systems of the late 19th century provided infrastructure for distributing populations without established lineages. Institutional care was followed by placement into communities needing workers, families, and inhabitants. The system appears as social welfare, documented as a humanitarian response to urban poverty. But what if it served another function, integrating a population whose origins could not be documented because those origins did not exist within the official narrative timeline? Where did these children come from? Why do their records begin without history, without families, without verifiable past? Where is the missing context? The intake forms remain. The question persists. The pattern is not local. It is not even continental. Photographs from Chicago before the 1893 World's Fair show a city that seems less developed than the massive exhibition infrastructure about to appear. Images of Vienna from the 1870s show grand boulevards and monuments amid residential areas that appear sparse. Paris during Haussmann's renovation reveals similar contrasts, monumental new structures and grand thoroughfares, yet photographs showing surprisingly empty streets. The synchronicity crosses borders and oceans, with European cities completing major monuments and American cities hosting massive exhibitions, infrastructure appearing quickly, sometimes seemingly too quickly, across continents during the same compressed timeline, roughly 1850 to 1900. Each city offers local explanations. Chicago experienced rapid growth following the Great Fire of 1871. Vienna saw imperial investment in capital improvement. Paris implemented Baron Haussmann's modernization program. The narratives differ in detail but share structure, intentional development, planned progress, and documented construction. Viewed globally, the similarities overwhelm the local variations. Similar architectural styles appear simultaneously. Similar completion timelines cluster in the same decades. Photographic documentation repeatedly shows monuments and infrastructure standing amid underdeveloped or provisional surroundings. A truly local phenomenon shows regional characteristics, unique features shaped by geography, culture, and available resources. But these developments show remarkable homogeneity: Gothic and Neo-Gothic monuments, Beaux-Arts exhibition buildings, grand boulevards, and systematic street grids, all appearing across vastly different cultural contexts within a compressed time frame. This is not random variation producing occasional similarities. This is systematic coordination of architectural style, construction timeline, and urban planning across national and continental boundaries, during an era when communication and transportation supposedly limited such coordination. Resets do not announce themselves with declarations. They reveal themselves through pattern, a synchronicity that cannot be fully explained by independent development, a similarity that suggests shared origin rather than parallel invention. The monuments stand in Cologne, Paris, Milan, Vienna, Chicago, and dozens of other cities. Photographs document similar contrasts. Timelines cluster in the same decades. Architectural sophistication appears suddenly rather than gradually. Individually, each case has explanations. Together they form a pattern that whispers a different story. Not gradual progress, but coordinated unveiling. Not construction, but revelation. Not creation, but inheritance. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago presented itself as a construction achievement, the White City erected in months on Jackson Park's undeveloped lakefront. Official guidebooks documented the transformation, marshland to monumental exhibition space through industrial-era efficiency and coordinated planning. Contemporary accounts expressed wonder at the speed of construction. Daniel Burnham, chief of construction, supervised the creation of over 200 buildings covering 600-plus acres. The scale seemed impossible, yet photographs documented the results. Massive Beaux-Arts structures, elaborate landscaping, functioning infrastructure including electric lighting, water systems, and transportation networks. But the timeline strains belief when examined closely. Planning began in 1890, major construction started in 1891. By 1893, the exposition opened with structures that rivaled permanent civic monuments in scale and sophistication. Then, after the exposition closed, these buildings disappeared, demolished, burned, or dismantled with the same remarkable efficiency that supposedly built them. Exhibition catalogues from the fair, preserved in the Chicago Historical Society archives, describe buildings using language typically reserved for permanent architecture, noting monumental construction, classical proportions, and enduring design principles. Yet these structures supposedly existed for months before vanishing. The pattern appears in other major exhibitions. The 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle and the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia each featured massive construction appearing rapidly, serving temporary purposes and then disappearing. Each was documented as deliberate construction and deliberate removal. But what if the sequence reversed? What if these exhibitions did not create the buildings but revealed them by temporarily removing whatever concealed structures already present, displaying them briefly, then reconcealing them? The idea is unsettling, and it forces a different question about intent and method. The notion seems absurd until compared to the alternative. Accepting that industrial-era construction could produce in months architectural achievements that supposedly took decades, only to demolish them immediately afterward. Accepting that cities repeatedly built and destroyed infrastructure at scales that strained economic and technical capacity. Showcases, not inventions. Revelations, not constructions. Temporary unveiling of what existed, waiting beneath accumulated concealment. The White City appeared in 1893. Photographs documented its splendor. Then it vanished, leaving only images and memories. What was already there, waiting to be unveiled? And why unveil it only briefly before returning it to concealment? The evidence accumulates across multiple domains. Architecture that appears before supporting infrastructure. Census records that claim populations not visible in photographs. Orphan systems that distribute children without documented origins. World exhibitions that build and demolish monumental structures in impossible timeframes. Synchronicity across continents suggests coordination rather than independent development. Each piece individually admits explanation. Long camera exposures, rapid industrialization, social welfare responses to urban poverty, engineering innovation, civic ambition. The official narrative has answers for each anomaly, but together, these pieces form a pattern the official narrative struggles to explain. Why do Gothic cathedrals across Europe all complete during the same compressed timeline? Why do photographs consistently show monuments amid underdeveloped surroundings? Why do orphan records across multiple nations show similar documentation gaps? Why do world's fairs build and destroy identical architectural styles repeatedly? One hypothesis emerges from the accumulated evidence: a civilizational interruption followed by repopulation and narrative repair. This suggests that the mid-19th century marked not gradual progress, but systematic resumption, that the monuments were not built but inherited, remnants of a prior civilization that survived whatever discontinuity occurred, that the populations were not immigrants but re-inhabitants, placed into infrastructure already present and given a narrative explaining it as their own construction. The orphan systems provide the mechanism: populations without traceable origins placed into communities, establishing new genealogies that begin at the documented restart point. The world exhibitions provide the reveal, temporary unveiling of architectural sophistication before returning it to concealment within narratives of recent construction. The photographs provide the evidence, visual documentation of structures existing before their official completion dates. Together, these observations form the claim that the cities were not built by the 19th century populations that inhabited them. The monuments existed before the modern cities formed around them. The infrastructure awaited inhabitants who arrived and were told they had built it themselves. This remains speculative. Alternative interpretation, not established fact. Pattern recognition, not proof. But what if the narrative we inherited is not construction history, but cover story? What if the 19th century marked not industrial revolution, but civilizational resumption? What if everything we were taught about our cities, our monuments, our origins, begins at a restart point, with actual history buried beneath the official timeline? Return to the original photograph, Cologne Cathedral circa 1868. Twin spires complete, streets provisional and empty. The image that opened this investigation. Initially it appeared as a curiosity, a photographic anomaly requiring explanation. The official narrative provided that explanation. Construction nearing completion, infrastructure still developing, photography's limitations creating an impression of emptiness that reality did not match. But examined through accumulated evidence, the photograph transforms. It no longer shows construction nearing completion, but inheritance recently occupied. It no longer documents progress, but reveals discontinuity. The emptiness is not a photographic artifact, but accurate representation, a monument standing amid a city not yet fully formed around it. The silence in the image now feels intentional, not absence of movement but absence of population temporary, not a construction site awaiting completion, but a completed structure awaiting inhabitants. The cathedral does not rise from the city forms around the cathedral. Gradually, as populations arrive and are integrated into infrastructure already present. Other photographs reveal the same pattern when re-examined. The empty boulevards of Paris during Haussmann's renovation are not construction zones, but revealed infrastructure, briefly visible before populations and narratives concealed the disconnect again. The massive exhibition buildings appearing in months are not new construction, but temporary unveilings, demonstrations of what existed beneath official timelines. Every archive holds these images: municipal collections, regional museums, national libraries, photographs showing monuments amid provisional surroundings, infrastructure before inhabitants, completion before population. The documentary evidence has always been accessible, but interpretation shapes seeing. The official narrative taught us to see gradual construction, progressive development, accumulated achievement. It provided explanations for every anomaly, industrial efficiency, civic ambition, photographic limitations. Once the pattern becomes visible, those explanations strain. The accumulated evidence suggests not gradual construction, but sudden inheritance. Not progressive development, but coordinated resumption, not achievement, but recovery of what already existed. The photograph has not changed. The cathedral stands, the streets remain empty, the silence persists in the frozen frame. But what it documents has transformed. Not completion, but discovery. Not construction's end, but occupation's beginning. Not the culmination of centuries of building, but the moment of inheritance before the narrative of self-construction replaced the visible truth. What else have we misread? What other photographs document inheritance while claiming construction? The archives remain open. The investigation continues. If the hypothesis holds, if populations inherited infrastructure rather than built it, the implications reach beyond architecture into identity itself. Genealogical records claim continuity. Family trees trace lineages backward through documented generations. Census records anchor populations in time and place. But if those records begin after a reset, if the starting point represents resumption rather than continuation, then ancestry becomes suggestion rather than certainty. The orphan systems of the late 19th century distributed children without documented origins into communities needing populations. Those children became ancestors for modern families. Their lack of traceable lineage did not matter in official terms. Institutions documented their placement, communities absorbed them, and new genealogies began at the documented restart point. But this means that for millions of people, family history begins at an arbitrary starting line. Grandparents appear without parents. Family origins begin in institutional intake forms or immigration records that lack prior documentation. The roots do not extend before the mid-19th century because that is where the documentary record starts. This creates genealogical uncertainty for entire populations. Not individual anomalies, but systematic incompleteness. Ancestry that traces backward only to a certain point, beyond which records fade into absence or contradiction. Institutional trust erodes when foundational narratives reveal inconsistencies. If the cities we inhabit existed before the populations that supposedly built them, what else has the official narrative concealed? If the monuments represent inheritance rather than achievement, what other accomplishments are actually rediscoveries? The question is not whether individual researchers, educators, or officials knowingly perpetuated false narratives. The question is whether the narrative itself inherited its own discontinuity, whether the populations who resumed civilization genuinely did not know they had inherited it, or whether they knew and chose to construct an alternative story of self-creation. Either possibility troubles. Unknowing inheritance suggests catastrophe so complete that civilizational memory vanished. Knowing concealment suggests coordination of narrative at scales that challenge understanding. For individuals examining their own genealogy, the implications feel personal. Are we descendants of continuous lineages extending centuries back, or occupants placed into existing infrastructure, given narratives of belonging, told we built what we inherited? The archives cannot answer this with certainty. The evidence suggests pattern, not proof, but the possibility remains, disturbing in its implications. Are we descendants or inheritors, builders or occupants of what was already built? The investigation does not end. It expands into ongoing observation, into questioning of accepted timelines, into examination of documentary evidence through lenses that official narratives discourage. Curiosity began this. interest in a photograph that seemed slightly wrong, a timeline that did not quite align, census numbers that contradicted visual evidence. Small anomalies easily dismissed individually, but anomalies accumulated, patterns emerged, synchronicity across continents suggested coordination beyond coincidence. Documentary evidence began suggesting inheritance rather than construction. Unease followed curiosity, the comfortable narrative of gradual progress, of civilizations building themselves through accumulated effort, of continuous lineages tracing backward through documented generations. That narrative holds emotional weight. It anchors identity. It explains origins. Accepting the alternative requires abandoning that comfort. It means considering that the cities we inhabit existed before our ancestors arrived, that the monuments we claim as cultural achievements represent inheritance from civilizations we do not remember, that our genealogies begin at arbitrary restart points beyond which history fades into reconstructed narrative. This acceptance does not come through proof. The evidence remains circumstantial, interpretive, pattern-based. No single document establishes civilizational reset with certainty. No photograph proves inheritance definitively. But the accumulated patterns persist. The photographic silence remains. The census contradictions continue. The architectural sophistication appears where it should not. The Orphan documentation shows systematic gaps. The world exhibitions build and destroy with impossible efficiency. The synchronicity across borders suggests coordination. Together these form a possibility that cannot be fully dismissed once seen. The official narrative still stands and still explains each individual anomaly, but the explanations feel increasingly strained when accumulated evidence is considered as pattern rather than isolated cases. The same photograph still hangs in municipal archives. The cathedral rises above Cologne, solid stone against sky. The streets around it now teem with traffic, commerce, life. The census records are complete from certain points forward. The family trees branch backward to documented starting points. But the silence in the early photographs persists. The empty streets remain visible in archival images. The pattern continues across continents and decades. The questions remain. The archive closes at designated hours, but the investigation does not close. The mystery does not resolve. The evidence waits, patient and silent, for those willing to see the pattern beneath the official story. The cathedral still stands. The streets are now crowded. The records are complete from a certain point onward. But the photograph remains unchanged. If the city rose after the monument, if the people arrived after the records began, if the infrastructure existed before the populations that supposedly built it, then the question is no longer how it was built, but who inherited it and why they were told they built it themselves. The archive closes, the silence stays.